Let's get Thiruniran, the second speaker of SGI, to tell us more about this.
Ladies and gentlemen, after hearing the first speaker just spoken, I feel very confident that I can stride right through this door. Now, I'd like to highlight what the main point that first opposition speaker made. Now, what he said essentially was that sovereign wealth funds should not disclose their information because it puts basically its nation's economy, population, and interests at risk. Now, from what my first speaker has already defined as sovereign wealth funds to be, we see that there's a clear misunderstanding. Now, I would like to solve this misunderstanding by distinguishing between what a state and performance is and what strategy and incentives of these sovereign wealth funds are. We only said that sovereign wealth funds are going to disclose their state and performance. And Jose, my first speaker, has already very clearly defined that it is their current state of investments, their portfolio by sector and geography, and their performance in terms of returns on information. No, sir. What we mean by strategy and incentives is their long-term investment plans. Now, we clearly acknowledge and understand that revealing your strategy makes you lose your competitive edge, as my opposition has already stated. Therefore, I'd just like to clarify that we're not actually going to ask sovereign wealth funds to reveal and disclose their strategies and long-term plans.
Points of information, sir?
No, sir. Now, I'd like to start by tracing back to the end of 2006 or early 2007. Now, investment banks were starting all over the world to feel the brunt of their lack of capital. And mainly, Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds began by injecting liquidity into the American market. Now, in the Middle East alone, there is $1.7 trillion worth of assets managed and controlled by sovereign wealth funds. And this figure, as Jose already pointed out, rises to $2.9 trillion globally. And that is the equivalent economic power of Germany, China, or the United Kingdom. Now, that is a lot of economic power and influence. Now,
points of information, sir?
No, sir. Banks need this capital that sovereign wealth funds so readily are willing to offer for financing their loans and investments. And on the other hand, sovereign wealth funds are also willing to go to banks because they can ride out the short-term fluctuations and instabilities that occur in the market. For example, like Jose already pointed out, Temasek has invested in Citigroup, and although it's lost $22 per share, they are willing to stay on and facilitate the stability because they ultimately see the long-term returns on investment.
Sir,
now, yes, sir.
Isn't the sovereign wealth fund's ability to prop up banks like Citibank already testifying to investor confidence and the strength of a sovereign wealth fund, sir?
Precisely, sir. We need these sovereign wealth funds to be there to stabilize these markets, and that is precisely what I shall be touching on further in my speech. Now, banks also actively seek out investments from sovereign wealth funds because they not only offer much greater liquidity, but they are also able to manage long-term risk, which private individual investments cannot afford to. Now, an example of this would be Morgan Stanley. 9.5% of shares of Morgan Stanley have been bought over by Singapore's Temasek Holdings, and 10% of Merrill Lynch is also owned by the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. Now, because sovereign wealth funds have so much to offer in terms of injections and liquidity into foreign markets, this means that the perceived risk, the risk perceived by investors, private individual investors, is lower, mainly because of the economic confidence and security that SWFs can offer. Now, most sovereign wealth funds come from countries which were in major financial crisis just about half a decade ago. No, sir. This means that they are built on stronger economic fundamentals. Now, why does this matter? The state we have reached today, a credit crisis, and therefore which has now degenerated into a liquidity crisis. This has happened simply because of a lack of liquidity and money in the system. Therefore, the fact that SWFs have so much power means they can stabilize the market, and as Jose already pointed out, because they stabilize the market by injecting liquidity, which in turn raises investor confidence.
Information, sir?
No, sir. Now, what is the main controversy here? When sovereign wealth funds become large stakeholders, they own more than 50% of foreign firms, investment banks, ports, and industries, for example, they have an inevitable condition of influence in these countries. Now, even though sovereign wealth funds may not necessarily have these hidden political agendas and do not pose any direct political threat to these countries as often perceived, it is inevitable that in the event of a crisis or in the event of weakening ties or strain of relations, there will be an inevitable backlash. Now, I shall go on to explain what these backlash might be. On the side of the sovereign wealth funds, they will not be willing to pull out their investments just like that because they are focused on long-term gains. Whereas the government of the country where the investments have been made would want the SWF to pull out because of the sheer economic and political influences the sovereign wealth funds have. Now, eventually what this matters is when sovereign wealth funds clearly and openly are able to disclose their financial state and performance and not their strategies and long-term plans, this will allow the government to more effectively assess and control the sovereign wealth funds' investments in their countries. Ultimately, what our policy means is that the great economic and political power of sovereign wealth funds can be channeled effectively so that all stakeholders ultimately benefit. This makes a maximum financial sense in today's investment markets, and this is why sovereign wealth funds should ultimately disclose their financial state and performance. Thank you.
Well, let's see what the opposition wants to say on this point. I call on Jaslyn of Innova JC to further the case for the opposition side.
Now, I beg to differ with the proposition's definition of the public as merely the investors in the market, because simply for a simple reason that just any information disclosed to people will be made known to just anyone out there. And as mentioned by our first speaker, Kenny, accountability to the public has to be balanced with protecting national interests. And therefore, amidst calls for greater disclosure of financial state and performance by sovereign wealth funds to the public, the question is exactly how much information should the public learn of. Entire disclosure of information, in our opinion, seems to be ridiculous. Limited disclosure of information should well be the path that most sovereign wealth funds should take. Logically, no investors will review its investment strategies, as that will invite unwanted rivalry. Transparency, therefore, would have to come with commercial viability. And why is it so? Quoting from Mr. Mohsin Khan, IMF Regional Director of Middle East and Central Asia, in an interview with Bloomberg in Dubai last year, revealing investment strategies by sovereign wealth funds doesn't seem to be a very sensible business decision. If they do so, no thank you. If they do so, anything they want to buy will become cheaper, and anything that they want to buy will become more expensive, and anything that they want to sell will become cheaper.
Point, madam.
No thank you. Another concern on why accountability to the public has to be balanced with protecting national interests is the populist pressures that government have to buffer. By disclosing investment returns regularly, assuming profits are made, then there will be calls for greater government expenditure by the citizens. Yet, this is not realistic, as these funds are being built up to buffer against contingencies like, say, a major worldwide recession. Then, if losses are made, disclosing it may culminate in a possible unrest. Thus, it is logical that sovereign wealth funds do not regularly disclose their financial status and information to the public, as they will have their own ups and downs.
Point, madam.
Sure.
Madam, the lack of transparency can sometimes hinder doors to investment. What do you say about that?
Sorry, beg your pardon
Point,
again.
madam, the lack of transparency may hinder doors to investment. What do you say about that?
No, I don't really think that it is the case, because transparency is not the main issue here about whether direct investments do come in, and I'll be covering on that later in my speech. A more sensible decision, quoting from Lee in an interview with Bloomberg News, is to disclose profits or losses over, say, a 5 to 10 year period. Besides, sovereign wealth funds are typically patient investors with long-term investment horizons. The shift in their currency or asset portfolios happen gradually over a longer period. Thus, it is of little use for any regular disclosure, as minimal change would be observed. Now allow me to move on to my next argument. Following sovereign wealth funds' recent investment in several Wall Street firms, such as CIC's investment in Morgan Stanley, there were mounting fears that these funds are driven by political rather than financial motivations, as they had bought into these financial icons at junk bond status, and this has resulted in calls for greater transparency. However, I would like to reiterate that such fears are often exaggerated or based on false premises. Most sovereign wealth funds are managed based on commercial considerations rather than any political objectives. Now let me tell you why it is so. In fact, long-term investors like sovereign wealth funds saw the current financial situation in the West as investment opportunities. Calculated risk has to be taken in the short to medium term, but in the long term, returns can be yielded. Quoting from Lee in an interview with Bloomberg and Stana, banks will be able to recover and rise again with the franchises, the expertise that they have, as well as proper leadership. And if China had really wanted to use its financial power to influence US policy, it would be far more likely to use its 1.8 trillion of central bank reserves than its 5 billion sovereign wealth fund stake in Morgan Stanley. To date, not a single incident of sovereign wealth funds destabilizing financial markets has come into public notice. Therefore, concerns raised are in fact unjustifiable, and so are the calls for greater transparency. Summing up, the focus of concern on sovereign wealth funds should be the professional management of these publicly owned financial assets. Having a professional team of experts and risk takers can help build a successful fund by maximizing returns, while managing the fund with responsibility, and therefore transparency issues are task secondary. Thank you.